All right, welcome to part two. Part two, we're going to go through the cerebrum. So I'm going to pull up a model here, and I'm going to go through the parts of the cerebrum that you need to know. Please, please, please get your lab worksheet. Go through your lab worksheet as I'm going through this video. That's going to be the easiest way to complete your lab assignment and be the most successful on your lab quiz. Okay, so go ahead and go through that. We'll finish up part two here today. We'll start off with the model, and then we'll go over to the PowerPoint and just briefly race through what we just went through on the model. Okay, all right, so let me grab that model, and we'll start off with Neuroanatomy part two. Okay, so let's talk about the Telencephalon now. Okay, Telencephalon, one of our secondary brain vesicles, and the telencephalon matures and develops into, remember this whole structure here, it's upside down. That's how it sits in the tray. But this is the cerebral cortex, okay, or the cerebral hemispheres, all right? And we have two hemispheres. We have a right and a left side, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove some lobes so that we can first talk about the first two lobes that I want to talk about, which is our frontal and parietal, and then we'll discuss the occipital lobe and then the temporal lobe, and then we're going to go over a fifth lobe called the insular lobe. All right, it's a little bit harder to see on here. Okay, so let's go ahead and remove these guys up top, or actually on the bottom, because this is the inferior aspect of the brain. So I'm going to go ahead and remove these. Okay, these are the temporal lobes. We'll get back to that in just a second. And I'm going to take my brain now, my cerebral hemispheres, the top portion. I'm going to flip them over so they're right side up. Okay. Now, this portion here, okay, this portion is the anterior aspect, and this is the posterior aspect. Okay. This is all gray matter here, as I said earlier. Remember, gray matter are unmyelinated cell bodies. Okay. This front portion here is the frontal lobe. You'll notice that along the surface, all this gray matter, there are some bumps and some valleys, or hills and valleys, like I like to call them. These bumps are called gyri, or gyri. Okay, that's the plural term for these. So these are all collectively known as gyri or gyri. Okay, however you want to pronounce it. If we look at just one, this is known as a gyrus. Okay, those are the hills, gyri. The valleys are called sulci. Okay, so these are called sulci. Once again, that's the plural term for these. Singular, it's just called a sulcus. All right, so we have our gyri and our sulci. And there's some important gyri that we need to talk about, and some important sulci that we need to discuss, because the sulci that we are going to discuss is what separates the lobes. And why do we separate the lobes? Well, because the different portions of the cerebrum, or the cerebral hemispheres, actually do different actions or produce different occurrences or actions throughout the body, okay, such as movement, all right, or conscious awareness of movement, or conscious awareness of sensory, okay? So we're going to go ahead and discuss all those. So first I'm going to show you on this brain here, excuse me, the different sulci that are important and gyri that are important. And then I'm going to pull up a different brain model and then show you, because it does a good job with color coding and discussing the different areas like the prefrontal cortex, the premotor cortex, the sensory cortex, okay, so on and so forth, all right? So let's first talk about the important sulci. The very, very first thing that I want to talk about here, though, is this real thick, deep groove going down the center. This is what separates our right and left hemispheres. This deep groove is called the longitudinal fissure. Really, really important. So we have our right cerebral hemisphere, our left cerebral hemisphere, and the two are separated by the longitudinal fissure. And if I open this up, you can see that we have gray matter along the inside of the longitudinal fissure. Okay? Okay, one thing I forgot to mention, or I'm not sure if I actually mentioned it or not, the really important aspect of the gyri and the sulci is to increase surface area. Okay, so if we were to actually take all of this tissue and stretch it out, it would be a lot longer, or it would cover a lot more area, let's say on the table, if we were to stretch all this out. And that's because of the gyri and the sulci. They increase surface area, so we can pack more stuff or mass into a smaller area. Okay, that's really, really important because we have billions and billions and billions of neurons and satellite cells within the brain. The satellite cells are basically the support cells of the brain to help the brain do its job. And the neurons, okay, the cell bodies, those are the ones that are doing the job and helping our body maintain control and run all the processes of our body. Remember, the brain serves the body and the body serves the brain. Okay, so it's a pretty good relationship between the two. All right. All right, so remember, we have the right and the left hemispheres. Okay, right and left cerebral hemispheres. But let's talk about now a specific sulci, okay, or a specific sulcus. All right, we're going to talk about several sulci, and really to discuss how these sulci separate the lobes of the brain. Okay, so right here, this is anterior and this is posterior. Okay, so if we look at all these gyri and sulci and we come here, you'll notice, and you maybe, to an untrained eye, it's kind of hard to see, kind of looks kind of all over the place, but there's actually a sulci that begins right here and goes all the way up. Okay, and I'm going to kind of tip this down for you, and you can see it here starting from the top. So I'm coming here, coming here, and then going all the way down. This right here is known as the central sulci, okay, or central sulcus, excuse me. Starts here and goes all the way up and all the way down. All right. This central sulcus separates the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. Okay, so here's the central sulcus. All right, really, really important sulci. And I'm going to show you on the other brain the central sulcus because it's a little bit easier to see the other brain model that we have. But because this doesn't have any color differentials, the other brain model does. But right here, this is the central sulcus, okay? And it separates the frontal from the parietal lobes. Really, really important to know that. Okay, so the gyri, remember all these hills, there's a really important gyri that's right here just behind the central sulcus, just posterior. So remember, anything anterior to the central sulcus is the frontal lobe. Anything posterior to the central sulcus is the parietal lobe. Then we'll get to the occipital lobe, but right here is the parietal lobe. Within the parietal lobe, so just posterior, there is a really important gyrus, okay? This is known as the post-central gyrus. Okay, so this post-central gyrus, really, really important landmark. Let me kind of tip here so you can see the superior portion of it. So here, post-central gyrus, the central sulcus is here, and the post-central gyrus is right here. What's really important of the post-central gyrus is it's known as the somatosensory cortex. Okay? The somatosensory cortex. The somatosensory cortex is a really, really important area of the brain where conscious awareness occurs, or the realization of really important sensory functions such as proprioception, or pain, hot touch, hot and cold touch, or anything like that, okay, is right along here, the somatosensory cortex, okay? Okay, I wanted to show you this brain model because obviously it's color-coded and there's a lot of different colors here that help denote the different lobes and the important gyri and the important sulci, okay? So, if we look here, we notice this is the central sulcus, okay? So right through here is the central sulcus, anterior, posterior. So here's our central sulcus, all right? This is the frontal lobe. This is the parietal lobe, all right? And remember this main gyri here, this main gyri just posterior to the central sulcus, this is, remember, known as the post-central gyrus, otherwise known as the somatosensory cortex, okay, the somatosensory cortex. So a little bit easier to see here, all right? Right here, just anterior to the central sulcus, we have the pre-central gyrus, pre-central gyrus. This pre-central gyrus is known as the motor cortex, okay? So the central sulcus separates the frontal and parietal lobes, and it also separates the post-central gyrus and the pre-central gyrus, and the somatosensory cortex and the motor cortex, okay? So another thing to add too with the motor cortex, okay, or the pre-central gyrus, all right, also known as the primary motor cortex, okay, that's really the better way to call it besides just motor cortex. Let's call it the primary motor cortex. This right here, this region right here, this is where conscious skeletal muscle control occurs. And we can break this down even further. The superior portion of the primary motor cortex is hip, trunk, shoulder movements, arm movements, wrist movements, finger movements, hand movements, neck movements, okay, eye movement, face movements, all right, our lips and jaw and tongue just all kind of down here, okay? So remember, central sulcus, our post-central gyrus, pre-central gyrus, somatosensory cortex, where sensory information gets integrated and conscious awareness occurs of sensory information, then conscious control of our muscles, skeletal muscles here, okay? This region here in our frontal lobe is known as our premotor cortex, okay? That's all up through here is our premotor cortex, all right? And then if we look at the very, very anterior portion of our frontal lobe, we have our prefrontal cortex through here, okay? So our right prefrontal cortex and our left prefrontal cortex, all right? Okay, so now that we've talked about the frontal lobe, okay, here, and the parietal lobe here, right? The two are separated by the central sulcus. Let's now discuss the parietal and the occipital lobe. So we're going to have to turn our skull here, or excuse me, our brain, all right? And we're still looking at the upper portion of the cerebral, or the cerebrum, excuse me, the cerebral hemispheres. And so this is the posterior aspect here, okay? So I want to show you the posterior aspect first, and we can see the longitudinal fissure. And then now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open up from the longitudinal fissure and show you the inner portion. So I'm going to set this aside. And now let's discuss the sulcus that separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. Okay, the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. And if you have your lab sheet, you'll notice that I'm basically going through all of the vocab terms that you have to identify and just briefly describe in your assignment what kind of goes on in those lobes and the importance of them, okay? So you don't have to go too far in depth, but describe them a little bit. So this is looking at the inside portion of our longitudinal fissure, okay? And we can see here, right here is an important sulci, okay, or sulci, or sulcus, all right? This right here is known as the parietal occipital sulcus. The parietal occipital sulcus. And it separates the parietal portion of the brain, or the parietal lobe, from the occipital lobe, okay? So right here is our parietal occipital sulcus. And I can show you, I'm going to keep my pen on it. The parietal occipital sulcus comes up and then through and around here. Okay, so this separates the parietal from the occipital lobe. Okay, so let me bring this guy back. So once again, we can see that sulci through here. Okay, it's through here, and it separates the parietal from the occipital lobes. All right. Okay, now a little recap. Now that we've identified the occipital lobes, okay, and then what actually separates, though, that parietal occipital sulci. Okay, really easy way to look at it is through the longitudinal fissure. All right. Let's review now the lobes that we've gone over. Okay, the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe. Okay, remember, separated by the central sulcus. All right, and then the occipital lobes. Remember, all of this through here is gray matter. And remember that that gray matter is unmyelinated cell bodies. All right? So hills and valleys are the gyri and the sulci, okay, or sulci, gyri, sulci, however you want to pronounce it. Okay, just make sure you get the spelling right on the test. All right? Now what I want to do is go over the last two lobes that we didn't go over, and that is the temporal or temporal lobe and the insular lobe, okay? Okay, so now I have the entire cerebrum together, all right? So the whole cerebrum now is together, and we can see all the lobes. Well, one of them we can't see, and we're going to go over which one we can't see here, okay? But we have all the lobes of our cerebrum put together, okay? Anterior, posterior, frontal lobe, central sulcus separates the frontal and the parietal. Remember, we have our primary motor cortex in the front, our somatosensory cortex in the back. So that is posterior, anterior, okay, separated by the central sulcus. All right. The parietal occipital sulcus separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. Okay. And then here we have the temporal lobe. Now the temporal lobe is separated by this sulcus that runs all through here. And this sulcus is called the lateral sulcus. Okay? And the lateral sulcus separates the temporal lobe from the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe in the back there. All right? So if I'm looking at the temporal lobe right here, deep inside the temporal lobe, there's actually a mini lobe, and this is our fifth lobe that we haven't talked about yet, and it's the insular lobe, okay? And the insular lobe is deep within this structure in here, so we're going to have to remove this and look inside to be able to find the insular lobe, which is our fifth lobe, all right? Okay, so now what I want to do is I'm just going to kind of lift up this structure here, and I want to kind of show you the inside of it. So longitudinal fissure, okay? If we lift up these top lobes, all right, if we lift up these top lobes, hold on please, I'm having a little bit of a problem. Let's keep these guys together just for the time being. We lift up these top lobes, we can see there are these cavities inside, okay? This cavity here is called the lateral ventricle. I almost lost my words there. The lateral ventricle, okay? And the lateral ventricle, there are several ventricles, the third ventricle, fourth ventricle, okay? And we'll go over these ventricles a little bit more in detail a little later. But what's inside these ventricles is what's called cerebral spinal fluid, okay? And inside these ventricles here, the cerebral spinal fluid just bathes all the tissue, and it helps to provide nutrients and so on and so forth, okay? So let me just take these lobes, set them aside, and kind of move them over there, all right? Then I'm going to take my temporal lobe, I'm going to split this off, and I'm going to hold it kind of at a sagittal view, okay? So this is a sagittal view here. Or excuse me, this is a transverse view. Sorry, this is the superior portion. This is a sagittal view. Okay, so I'm going to hold this at a transverse view and kind of hold it up. This is the lateral aspect of the temporal lobe. So kind of hard to see because for some reason my camera just doesn't want to focus too well. But what I want to show you here is this through here. This kind of striated, if you can see that, not too well maybe, but this striated tissue, this is called white matter. Okay, remember we talked about gray matter surrounding the outer portion of the cerebrum. Well, all through here, this is white matter. Remember, gray matter is unmyelinated cell bodies. And you can kind of see that just real closely all along here. Okay, sorry, I know it's blurry and it just doesn't want to focus. That is kind of annoying. Maybe if I hold it a little farther back, you'll be able to see it, but it'll focus a little bit better. But this is gray matter here. So these are all cell bodies, okay, unmyelinated cell bodies. And right here is white matter. White matter is myelinated, so a sheath that surrounds it, myelinated axons. So these are all axons that attach onto the cell bodies. And these axons come on down and go on through and synapse with the terminal endings, the terminal butts, okay? Synapse with another cell body and the dendrites of a cell body, okay? And that's how information is passed, that chemical electrical signal that occurs that helps provide all of the processes in the human body, okay? Another good thing to denote here with this view is you can see how the sulci just kind of really divot in and help really improve the surface area so that we can have a lot of neurons in a tightly packed space. Okay. So this ventricle here, remember this large ventricle, this is the lateral ventricle, and this is where cerebral spinal fluid is housed, okay, and also flows. So cerebral spinal fluid flows from one ventricle to the other and then down around our spinal cord. So this red and blue structure through here, try and really come in. Once again, sorry that this doesn't sharpen some and really focus in. But this red and blue structure, this is found throughout several landmarks or portions within the ventricles, in the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle, okay? And this is called the choroid plexus, okay? Okay, so once again, that is the choroid plexus, okay? And this helps to produce cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, and there's cells that produce that cerebral spinal fluid in there called glial cells, okay, or glial cells, kind of however you want to describe it. But we'll go over those in detail later. So these choroid plexus, they can be found throughout the brain in the ventricles, okay, and they're either found, such as in this case here, the temporal, found on the floor of the lateral ventricle, but they can also be found on the roof of the ventricles or in different areas of the ventricles. For instance, I'm going to bring this other portion of the brain here within view. And this other portion of the brain, this is the brain stem, the midbrain, and the diencephalon here. But you notice here, the diencephalon, you can see a choroid plexus here, and this is part of a ventricle as well. Okay, we'll talk about this in more detail later, and I just wanted to show it to you quickly, just so I can show you another example of a choroid plexus. But I want to show you this built into the brain itself, so you can see how it sits in the middle portion of the brain. All right. So back to here, our temporal lobe. Remember, this is the superior portion, so that means that this is the bottom floor, basically, of the lateral ventricle there. And then at the very, very posterior aspect, this is anterior, this is posterior. At the posterior aspect of the lateral ventricle here, we have this area just here, just at the very end of the choroid plexus. And this is called our hippocampus. And our hippocampus is really important because this is where memory is integrated from all our senses and motor cortex. A lot of neurons come through this area and integrate into this area to help create short-term and long-term memory. So this is our hippocampus here, okay? Okay, so I kind of have the brain put together here, the cerebrum, excuse me. So the cerebrum's put together here. Now what I want to show you, the last little bit of the cerebrum that I want to show you, besides all the lobes that we went over and the longitudinal fissure and all that fun stuff, is this. So I'm going to kind of just lift this up. Now this is a bottom-up view. So we're looking at the inferior portion here. I'm kind of adjust the camera just slightly. So we're looking at the inferior portion here of our temporal lobes, okay? Occipital lobes here in the back. And what I want to do here is I'm just going to kind of remove the temporal lobes. Remember, we just went through the inner portion of the temporal lobes there, talked about the choroid plexus and the lateral ventricle. But I want to show you this portion here. So you can see how these are kind of divoted out. This is actually where our diencephalon sits in, okay? So our diencephalon sits in here like so, okay, just like that. All right, and this is our midbrain and brainstem here, so our pons and our medulla oblongata and so on and so forth, if you remember back when we talked about the secondary vesicles and how they differentiate into these. But we'll go over the diencephalon and the brainstem and all that sort of fun stuff in the next video. But I want to finish up here with the cerebrum. So you can see here the lateral ventricles here in the cerebrum, okay? And a lot of communication occurs in this region here. Sorry, my hand was covering that. A lot of communication occurs in this region here, back and forth from the cerebral cortex, so the somatosensory cortex, the primary motor cortex, the premotor cortex, all of the gray matter, unmyelinated cell bodies, all of the interpretation or the conscious awareness of occurrences in life gets communicated through here, through important communication highways. I'm not going to go over the name of those, but just know that the communication occurs here and transfers through into the hypothalamus and the diencephalon area, and then down through the brainstem and the spinal cord. So if we need to move or have a voluntary movement, that occurs through there, okay? And these are the lateral ventricles here, okay? You can see here, this right here, this is the anterior portion, and the frontal lobes. This is the inferior aspect of the frontal lobes. And these right here are actually cranial nerve number 1. We'll go over cranial nerves here later on, but this is cranial nerve number 1, olfactory nerve. Okay, this is in charge of smell. And if you remember back in 216, Anatomy 1, we talked about the olfactory bulbs and the olfactory nerves and how they go through the skull and the cribriform plate and the olfactory foramina. Okay, that was right there that we talked about. So this sits on the ethmoid bone of the skull and the cribriform plates, and that's the olfactory nerves there, cranial nerve number 1. Okay, so that kind of sums up the cerebrum. So we discussed gray matter, white matter, the gyri, the sulci, the cerebral hemispheres split by the longitudinal fissure. Okay, the central sulcus that splits the frontal from the parietal, anterior superior. Okay, the lateral sulcus that separates the temporal from the other lobes, the parietal occipital sulcus, remember, right here, that separates the occipital from the parietal lobes. Okay, we went over our lobes, and then the one lobe that we couldn't see that is inside the temporal lobe, that is known as the insular lobe. Okay, so that's basically the cerebrum. Real quick, let's go back to this guy. Okay, so here we really get a good view of the different lobes because they're all color-coded and the different cortexes. All right, so we have our frontal lobe here. Okay, so this is our frontal lobe here, and you see the different colors: our prefrontal cortex, premotor cortex, primary motor cortex, central sulcus, our somatosensory cortex. Remember, these are also known as precentral gyrus, postcentral gyrus, because our central sulcus is here. Okay, our parietal lobe, and then here, our occipital lobe. Okay, in our occipital lobe, a lot of visual interpretation occurs. This gets transmitted from the front part of our skull, basically, where our eyes are. Okay, if you remember back from 216, we had the optic canal. Okay, our optic nerve kind of goes through the center of our brain, through the center portion of the midbrain, what is the mesencephalon, okay? And then that visual information goes to the corpus quadragentum, okay? And then eventually reaches the occipital lobe and we have visual awareness or conscious awareness here that occurs. So visual interpretation, visual input, all right, are in this region here. We'll get into this stuff here in a little bit. This is our cerebellum. Okay, but let's finish up with the cerebrum itself, and then that'll be another video. All right. All right, guys. So let's do a quick little recap of what we did with the model. Okay. So Neuroanatomy Part 2. We're finishing up this video, and then we can move on to the brainstem and the midbrain and talk about the pons and all that fun stuff. All right. Okay. So here is a really good view. This is an actual cadaver brain. This is a really good view of, first of all, the blood vessels in the outer covering, basically the meninges, okay, of the brain. And this is a good view of the longitudinal fissure. All right. So we can see the longitudinal fissure here. Okay, it separates our right and left hemispheres. All right. Yeah, and we can have a good view here of all our gyri or gyri and sulci or sulci. Okay, so remember our valleys and our hills. All right. So let's talk about the really specific important sulci and how it separates our lobes. Okay. So first things first, remember we have the central sulcus, all right? And this central sulcus separates the parietal lobe from the frontal lobe, okay? And remember we have some really important gyri that we wanted to talk about, like the precentral gyrus, okay? So our precentral gyrus is here. Remember, this is where our primary motor cortex is, all right? And then we have our premotor cortex here, and then our prefrontal cortex, all right? So, some important stuff to review. Then on this side, we have the post-central gyri, and remember that is the somatosensory cortex. All right, where a lot of conscious awareness of sensory information that comes in. Okay, let's move on. The lateral sulcus. Okay, and the lateral sulcus separates the temporal lobe from the other lobes. All right, and then here is our parietal occipital sulcus. Okay, and that separates the occipital lobe from the parietal lobe. All right. So there you get a good image of this. Make sure that you're going through and you have your lab worksheet with you and you're able to complete this and talk about the importance of these structures, okay? Because that's going to be on your quiz. I mean, I can't stress all of this is going to be on your quiz, okay? So study up, study up. All right, remember there was that one lobe that I said that we couldn't get to. So this is a good view. We have our frontal lobe in red, our parietal lobe in that darker blue, our occipital lobe in the lighter blue, and then the darkest blue, almost like a bluish purplish, we have the temporal lobe. Well, if we are able to dissect away the temporal lobe and the frontal lobe, we see the insular lobe right here. Okay, so that is deep. This is the fifth lobe, and it's really small, okay, and it's kind of deep within. So that's the insular lobe, all right? This is a really good slide. I'm not going to read everything off this slide, but I want you to go ahead and review this slide, okay? It has all the pertinent information that you need to know, okay? You can see Broca's areas with speech formation, what occurs in the prefrontal lobe, the premotor cortex, the primary motor cortex, so on and so forth, okay? So you can kind of just see all the important stuff of our cerebrum. Take notes on this, write down what's occurring in these regions because you may, asterisk, have a test question directly from this slide, okay? So take a second and check this slide out. And then lastly, this is just a really cool cross-sectional area, or a sagittal view, I should say, of the longitudinal fissure. So here we can see the cerebrum and all of the gray matter of the cerebrum here. Okay, pretty neat to see this. You can see the gyri and the sulci. All right, and then is a really good view of our diencephalon, okay, which we're going to discuss. So we'll start off the part 3 lab lecture or lab video with the diencephalon here in this image here, and then we'll talk about the cerebellum, the pons, okay, the midbrain area, and then the medulla oblongata. Okay, all right. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video and you were able to gain something out of it. Once again, please study up. Take your time through these videos. Rewatch them 1 or 2 times. And for lecture, make sure that you are doing the online supplemental software, Caduceus, and knocking out the assignments in those, okay? The lectures, the video lectures that I post in the lecture format of the course is going to be less in-depth than these lab video lectures, and that's because we utilize Caduceus as ancillary material for the lecture, okay? So for labs, these are what the videos are going to be like, and then for lecture, you'll have a lot of ancillary material and assignments that you have to go through with that online software that was mandatory to get, okay? All right, good luck, study up, and I'll see you on the flip side.